Inflation is back near normal levels. In the United States, it peaked above 9% in 2022. Today, it's around 2.4%, almost exactly where central banks want it. Across advanced economies, the pattern is the same. By every official measure, the crisis is over. And yet, it doesn't feel that way. Groceries are still expensive, rent is still high, everyday costs haven't gone back to where they were. So if inflation is under control, why doesn't it feel like it? Because the number we call inflation doesn't measure what most people think it does. Inflation is not the level of prices, it's the speed at which prices change. When inflation was at 9%, prices were rising very quickly. Now that inflation is closer to 2%, prices are rising more slowly, but they're still rising. And more importantly, they're rising on top of a much higher base. Between early 2020 and early 2026, prices in the United States increased by roughly 25.7% in total. That means something that cost $100 before now costs about $126. That increase doesn't go away when inflation falls. It becomes the new starting point. So when people hear that inflation is back to normal, what they expect is relief. They expect prices to fall, or at least to feel cheaper again. But that's not what the system is designed to do. It's designed to stop prices from accelerating, not to reverse the increases that already happened. And that gap between what people expect and what the system actually delivers is where the discomfort comes from. To understand why, you have to look at how inflation really works beneath the surface. At its core, inflation operates on two separate layers: the rate of change and the level of prices. The rate tells you how fast things are moving. The level tells you where things have already landed. When inflation spikes, the rate jumps. But when inflation falls, the level usually doesn't. You can see this most clearly in categories like housing. Rent increases quickly during inflationary periods, but it almost never declines in the same way. It just stops rising as fast. The same pattern applies to services, food, and labor-intensive sectors. Once costs move up, they tend to stick. That stickiness is built into how the system works. Businesses adjust prices upward to reflect higher costs: materials, wages, transportation. Once those adjustments are made, reversing them would mean accepting lower margins or losses. So instead of cutting prices, companies hold them steady and wait for costs to stabilize. And that creates a one-directional bias. Prices rise faster than they fall. At the same time, wages, the other side of the equation, don't adjust as fast. During the inflation surge of 2021 and 2022, prices jumped rapidly. Wages did increase, but not at the same pace, and not immediately. Even as wage growth continued into 2023 and 2024, it was catching up to a cumulative increase that had already happened. In simple terms, people weren't just dealing with higher prices, they were dealing with the gap between when prices rose and when their income adjusted. And that gap doesn't disappear overnight. Even today, with inflation around 2.4% and core inflation near 2.5%, many households are still operating under a cost structure that reset upward over a short period of time. Which means the feeling of being behind doesn't come from current inflation, it comes from past inflation that hasn't been fully absorbed. But prices and wages don't fully explain the persistence. There's a third layer driving the system: expectations. When businesses set prices, they don't just look at current cost, they look at where they think costs are going. When workers negotiate wages, they don't just consider what inflation was, they consider what it might be. This creates a feedback loop. If businesses expect costs to remain elevated, they price accordingly. If workers expect prices to stay high, they push for higher wages. And that interaction stabilizes the system at a new level. Inflation, in that sense, isn't just something that happens, it's something that gets built into behavior. And once it's built in, it becomes much harder to reverse. This is exactly what happened during the inflation surge that began in 2021. The initial shock was sudden and powerful. Massive fiscal stimulus boosted demand at a time when global supply chains were still constrained. Production bottlenecks, shipping delays, and labor shortages limited supply just as consumers were spending more. Then energy prices surged, especially after geopolitical disruptions like the war in Ukraine, pushing costs even higher. The result wasn't a gradual increase in prices, it was a rapid reset. Inflation in the U.S. jumped from 1.2% in 2020 to 4.7% in 2021, then to 8% in 2022, with a peak of 9.1% in mid-2022, the highest level in over 40 years. Globally, the pattern was similar, with inflation reaching between 8% and 8.7% in 2022. Prices didn't just rise, they jumped to a new level in a very short period of time. And once they reached that level, the system had to adjust around it. Central banks responded by raising interest rates aggressively. The goal was to reduce demand, slow borrowing, and bring inflation back down. Institutions like the Federal Reserve made it clear the priority was to bring inflation back toward 2%, and they succeeded, at least in terms of the rate. By 2023, inflation had fallen to around 4.1%. By 2024, it was under 3%. By 2025 and early 2026, it stabilized around 2.4 to 2.6%. But notice what didn't happen. Prices didn't fall. Raising interest rates slows the economy. It reduces demand. It stops prices from rising as quickly. But it doesn't rewind the price level that has already been set. Policy can stop the damage from getting worse, but it doesn't undo it. And that distinction is critical, because it explains why inflation can be over in a technical sense while still feeling very present in everyday life. You can see this most clearly in the categories that drive daily experience. Housing costs, for example, are still rising at around 3% annually. Services inflation remains elevated in many economies due to tight labor markets and steady wage growth. Globally, even as headline inflation falls to around 3.7 or 3.8% in 2026, core components remain stubborn. This is what economists call sticky inflation. It doesn't spike dramatically, but it doesn't fall quickly either. And that creates a second layer of persistence. Even after the initial shock fades, the system continues to operate at a higher cost structure. So while the data shows improvement, the lived experience doesn't match. And that gap has consequences. One of the most visible is the growing disconnect between economic indicators and public perception. Consumer sentiment often lags behind inflation data. People continue to feel pessimistic about the economy even as key metrics improve, because from their perspective, the improvement isn't visible. Prices are still higher than they were, paychecks are still catching up, and daily decisions still feel constrained. So behavior starts to change. Consumers adjust. They trade down to cheaper alternatives. They delay purchases. They become more selective about spending. Not because inflation is still high, but because the new price level has forced a recalibration. And over time, something more subtle begins to happen. People stop comparing current prices to what things used to cost. They start accepting the new level as normal. This is the point where the system stabilizes, not when prices fall, but when expectations adjust. Normal doesn't return, it gets redefined. And this pattern isn't unique to this cycle. Across countries and across time, inflation shocks don't reverse, they reset. After major inflationary episodes, economies rarely go back to their previous price levels. Instead, they settle into a new equilibrium. Even today, while advanced economies like the US, the Euro area, and Canada are close to their inflation targets, the global picture shows how varied outcomes can be. Some countries like Switzerland or Japan maintain very low inflation. Others like Argentina or Iran continue to struggle with elevated levels. And in extreme cases like Venezuela, hyperinflation completely destabilizes the system. But across all of these cases, the same principle holds. Inflation doesn't just move prices, it resets them. And once that reset happens, the system adjusts around it. Which brings us back to the original question. Will inflation ever feel normal again? The answer depends on what normal actually means. If normal means prices going back to where they were before the surge, then no, that's not how the system works. But if normal means stability, predictable prices, steady wages, and expectations that align with reality, then the process is already underway. Inflation, as a rate, has largely normalized. But what hasn't normalized yet is perception, because perception takes longer to adjust than the data, and that leads to a deeper realization. Inflation doesn't really end when the prices stop rising. It ends when people stop expecting them to go back down. What feels like ongoing inflation is often something else entirely. It's the economy settling into a new baseline that was set during a period of shock. The system hasn't failed to return to normal. It has already established a new one. If this helped you understand why inflation still doesn't feel normal, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to see what's coming next for the global economy, click the video on your screen.